So, welcome everyone. Welcome to this online beer talk of campus security. I'm Ville and I will guide you today through the security best practice for on-premise environments. First, a little introduction about myself. So, my name is Ville Koch. I worked for about 15 years, a bit more, as a system engineer in different Swiss companies. In 2018, I decided to do a certificate of advanced studies in cybersecurity. And in 2019, I joined Campus Security as a security analyst. I'm mostly responsible for internal and external pen test projects, web app pen tests, but I also do a lot of concept reviews and stuff like that. You can find me on the different social media platforms with the details you can see below. And in my free time, I like to be out in the nature, and especially I like to go fishing and traveling. So first, about the agenda of the talk today. Um, I will start with a little introduction where I will talk about why this beer talk today and why we decided to have this topic. Then I'll talk about some issues we often find in pen tests. Then we come to the main part of our security best practices, how we set them together and where you can find them. And at the end, I'll present some tools you can use for identifying issues in your network, and then we'll have some time for questions. For the questions, you can join the IRC chat, which was sent along with the invitation. And my colleague Manu will collect the questions, or you can also just write questions at the end. So why this beer talk? Why this topic? In the past, we often realized that in many internal pen tests, we find the same issues over and over again. And we saw that usually smaller and medium-sized companies struggle with the same issues. And very often the resources in their IT, there are not enough resources to also do some proactive work like implementing best practices, and most often they can just manage to operate the IT and install security updates. Also, due to the documentation, which often is large and complex, you have to go through different places where it's documented for all the different best practices. And then the prioritization is very difficult if you don't have the technical knowledge, so you don't really know where to start. So I did the research in the past few weeks, and the goal was to provide some guidance for our customers and other smaller companies to help prioritize and to explain the most important security best practices in a possible short way. About the issues we identify repeatedly. So let's start with the bad password practices. One point there is we often identify easy to guess passwords like initial passwords. And what does this mean? So often help desk resets the password for end users and uses some sort of initial password like summer 2020 or winter 2020, or be it the company name. And there are tools nowadays, ton of different tools, which allow an attacker or someone trying to do malicious activities to easily use such a password or identify accounts which have an initial password. So within seconds in a large environment, you can identify users with such weak passwords. And then technically the account is compromised. There is also often the issue with default passwords. So when you buy services or let's say hardware, switches, firewalls, they usually come with some default passwords. And the problem there is if you don't change them, well, there's a ton of online databases available where I can search for such default passwords. And there is even complete GitHub repositories where they are being collected together, so you can go through a ton of default passwords easily if you know what device is being used or what service. Then the issue with crackable passwords. So even though password policies require you to choose also special characters and minimum lengths, etc., humans unfortunately often decide to set easily guessable passwords or passwords which have been in many breach passwords lists. So since they are used in password cracking attacks, it's often very easy to crack such passwords, or with the hardware, depending on what hardware you have, it might take seconds to crack a hash of such a password. Then we have another password issue, which is password stored in plain text, meaning there is, for example, the Active Directory, which has certain LDAP attributes like the description field, which we have seen being used to store passwords, because why not? It's easy to tell everyone, hey, this user's password is actually that, if it's a technical account, which is not good, of course. And then also plain text passwords or credentials on shares or local drives lying around. Then another issue with passwords is the password reuse, meaning when you have a target company, a domain you want to attack, what you can do nowadays, there is complete databases, whole databases where you can search for either a domain name, which goes through the breached password list and tells you, hey, for this domain there is that much passwords being found. Or you can also use, for example, the password database of Troy Hunt to check single email addresses. And what you can do then is use other databases like Shodan as an example, where you can either search for whole companies to see what services they have exposed. So in Shodan, basically Shodan is a database containing all internet exposed services and all IP addresses. Or you could just go for, let's say, I'm interested in internet exposed Citrix login pages, Citrix gateways. So you can search for them, and based on the passwords in the breach password databases, you can then attack those services. And this is actually also something which was just recently used in the colonial pipeline hack. So what the attackers had there, they identified a password in the breach password database. They realized that this was being reused as a VPN access or in a VPN account, and it was still enabled. And there was no multi-factor authentication. So that's how they had their first step into the network of this colonial pipeline company. Then about data on sensitive data on shares. So in many environments, unfortunately, you find tons of shares which are open to anyone. And for this, there is nowadays different tools as well you can use. So it's very easy to identify such open shares where everyone has read access. And then you can use other tools, like in this example, this tool called Snaffler, which allows you to search for either file types or even keywords in specific file types. So you can quickly identify passwords or SSH keys, certificates, etc. Another issue is with the permissions. So many environments, unfortunately, provide local admin credentials quite easily to all their users, be it because of they need to install software or something like that. And this is unfortunately a very underrated issue. And as you can see in these reports from Beyond Trust, which they do make every year, so they check all the Microsoft security advisories from every year, and they check the facts behind them and put them together. So in the last 2 years, a major part of the critical vulnerabilities would have been mitigated simply by removing local admin rights of end users. Another issue with that is when users have local admin rights, so let's say you have here user Jesus, who is local admin on his machine, and now he opens a phishing mail or an attachment in a phishing mail, and this triggers a connection back to the attacker. So now attacker Kane here has compromised this user's machine and this local admin on it because he takes over the session of Jesus, which is local admin. What he can do then is either install persistence, meaning he could install a Windows service or a scheduled task or some startup application that every time Jesus logs in again or starts the machine, Kane has immediately the connection. What he can also do with these local admin rights is he can directly extract credentials locally, meaning he can get the hashes of the logged in accounts or any local accounts which are configured on this machine. And with that, he could also try to see if there is some password reuse in the network. So for example, if other local accounts use the same password, and you can use this for so-called lateral movement attacks. Another thing with permissions is, of course, the domain admin permissions. So very often there are domain administrator accounts being used for daily tasks like connecting to clients or to different servers. And with tools like in this example, Bloodhound, you can figure out where are those sessions, if there are any, and from which account to which system. And as an attacker, if you know there is a domain admin logged in on some client, you can compromise this client, and then you can extract domain admin credentials the same way. And another thing with domain admins being used, the problem here is as well that authenticated network connections are being done within the network. That has a little bit to do also with how Windows behaves by default. So let's say in this example here where you have a client which connects to a UNC path, meaning a host name, a share. What Windows then does is the name resolution, and this happens like that first it checks, is this name the local machine? If it's not the local machine, it checks the local cache file. Then it checks the local host file for any entry. Afterwards, it queries the DNS server, and if the DNS server doesn't respond with an IP address for this host name, be it because it doesn't exist, it's not registered, or there's maybe a typo in it, Windows makes broadcast messages with LLMNR and NetBIOS. So this is an issue because if there is an attacker in your local subnet, he can use tools to listen to these connections and tell the client, hey, I am indeed this guy, provide the IP, and then the client connects to him. So the attacker can capture this broadcast. He can set up a specific tool, like in this example, the responder tool. And then this listens automatically for those connections, sends a poisoned answer, meaning sends the client his IP address of his attacking machine or the machine he compromised. And then the client responds with an authenticated session. And if it's in that case a domain admin, then the attacker has the net NTLM hash or sometimes even the NTLM hash from the domain admin and can use this for further attacks. A little side note about Windows and broadcast. So the guy who created this tool, Responder, recently figured out that even with the newest Windows Server release, Windows unfortunately still does a lot of broadcast. And for example, if you open the start menu, which at the same time is a search bar, and you connect to a UNC path like that, what happens is with every single character you type in, Windows does broadcast because since it's at the same time a search bar, it searches for whatever you type in. So there's a lot of noise being generated. Then topic around network segregation. So in many networks, we see that they only have a firewall protecting the network from external access from the internet or outgoing. But then there is no firewall within the environment, meaning once an attacker has compromised a client, let's say through a phishing, he has then open access to all the other systems and services within the network without that the firewall is blocking access. And now he can basically use further attacks, as I mentioned before, be it bad password practices, meaning checking for any weak passwords or any privileged connections or sensitive data on shares. Then outdated and vulnerable software, of course, there is not much to say here. If you followed the news recently, you could see all kind of different headlines about companies being hacked because of outdated devices, and most famous of this year most probably being the exchange hack, where hundreds of thousands of companies worldwide got hacked. Then you often also see that hardening is not being done on, be it on clients or servers. And the problem there is especially on clients when you have Office that, for example, the default macro settings in Office are still active and not hardened. What does this mean? The default setting disables macros with notification, but what many people don't understand, with notification actually allows the end user to enable the macro with this bar you can see on top. And this is something which is also often used in social engineering attacks, phishing attacks. So the content of the malicious Excel or Word is then designed to convince the end user to click on this enable button, and from then on they have a connection to the machine. Also regarding hardening is that hard disks are often not encrypted, no matter if it's a physical hard disk in a client or a hard disk of a virtual machine. In this example, we could identify a virtual machine disk lying around on a share, and since it was not encrypted, you can just take this virtual machine hard disk and extract the relevant files to extract credentials out of it. So then you have the local accounts of this virtual machine and most probably also passwords which are used on other systems. Another thing is with missing SMB signing, which unfortunately is a quite bad default setting from Microsoft. So every SMB connection which is being done with Windows, for example, when you connect to a UNC path, is not signed. What does this mean? Well, the attacker can try to man in the middle the connection or listen to it and relay it. So let's say he compromises a machine and then uses this to man in the middle it or even relay it to another system. So this brings us to our security best practices. And for that, I would first quickly explain the Microsoft admin tier model. And the Microsoft admin tier model looks approximately like that. So this is actually quite old. They implemented that or designed that many years ago. And the idea is that you split your environment into 3 different tiers, meaning in tier 0, you have your domain admins and your domain controllers, or all the critical systems containing the credentials to your kingdom. In tier 1, you have your sensitive business data, for example, your database servers or your application servers. And in tier 2, you have your end users and the workstations. And the idea here is, or the important goal of this tiering model is that you then disallow any logon from a lower to a higher tier, meaning, for example, no domain admins are allowed to log into any other tier than tier 0. And also the other way around, admins from, let's say, tier 2 or tier 1 are not allowed to control any accounts from another tier. Microsoft actually superseded this tiering model just a few years ago. Now they designed this enterprise access model, and this focuses more on hybrid environments, meaning not only on-prem but also on-prem and cloud environments where you have a mixed environment. And it also focuses on a zero trust approach, meaning you basically check every single connection if it's authenticated or not, in very simple words. And if you compare this to the admin tier model, technically what you can say is you have the tier 0, which is your control plane here, which holds all the Active Directory and the domain controllers. Then you have tier 1, the business data, which is in this case in the management plane, and the data and workload plane. And then you have tier 2 with your end users, which is the app access and the user access plane. So we took this as a basis, and together with our findings we had repeatedly, we compiled a list of measures, and we categorized these measures into 5 categories. So we have the organizational measures, which is defining processes, training employees, etc. We have the configurational measures, which is about configuring settings and servers and clients. We have account and privilege management measures, which is about creating accounts and allocating permissions to those accounts. Then we have the password management measures, which is all about defining strong password policies and enforcing them. And last but not least, the network measures, which is about segregation of networks and enforcing strong firewall rules. So let's have a look at some measures. First of all, the point with hardware and software inventory. If you have followed the news recently about the RUA case, you might have heard something about that. What is important here? So you really should know all the systems which are in your network. You need to have a proper inventory, and also of the software which is running on those systems and what versions they have. So you need some central system, which, for example, a monitoring server, an antivirus server, patch management server, which they then identify all systems, all services, and inventorize them. So if you have an outdated system in your network, this is of course a risk, and this should be accordingly updated and inventorized as well. And the other thing is you should be able to identify rogue systems. For example, if an attacker connects a machine to your network, you want to be able to differentiate between a legit machine or a rogue machine and an attacker machine, and you want to be able to block this connection to the network. Another point is about backups. And yeah, a good password policy has many important points. And one I would like to focus on here is that you should really make sure that you store your backups offline, completely disconnected. Because if you're a victim of a ransomware, a big ransomware attack, you really want to make sure that all or those backups, you have some backups left somewhere disconnected, that if the ransomware also gets to the backups attached to servers, to your backup machines, you want to be safe of that. And we often have people arguing that, yeah, but our backups are safe. It's only accessible via backup console, and only 1 or 2 guys in our environment have access to this backup console. Well, what happens if the backup admin's machine gets compromised? Then your backups are technically gone as well. So you should always assume breach of your backup infrastructure. Another point about logging and monitoring. So you should have a centralized log server. You should enable all relevant logs in all the different components, be it software or Windows machines. So you should have a proper Windows audit policy. Check that your Windows firewall and also all the hardware and network firewalls are logging all needed connections and changes, and also of course that antivirus is logging all relevant events. For this, we have actually released or published a blog last year in September, which you can check. And we have also added a cheat sheet to the repository, which I will show you soon, with some basic GPO settings. And we also plan to publish a new checklist soon, which covers a little bit more than just detection of lateral movement. You need to make sure that you forward then your logs to this centralized log server. And you need to define some alert triggers, meaning, for example, if someone tries to log in with an account multiple times with the wrong password, that some alert is being triggered, or if someone assigns domain admin permission to an account, that this is being alerted as well. And then, of course, you need to have some responsibles who are constantly getting those alerts and checking them. And one more thing about enabling locks. Don't just go there and think I'm gonna just enable everything, then I'm covered, because then your operation team or SOC or whoever is responsible for going through those logs won't have a hard time. Then we have a point about privileged access workstations. So usually nowadays people in IT have a laptop. They use this laptop for reading emails, browsing the internet, for daily tasks, and then they use the same machine to connect to their server systems, be it domain controller or application server or whatever. And this is a problem because once your machine is compromised, then the ransomware or the attacker can also abuse these connections you did to the servers. So the goal here is to separate daily tasks from privileged access tasks, and this is where the privileged access workstation concept comes into play. And important here is the privileged access workstation has to be deployed regarding the clean source principle, and this means the source has to be as secure as the target you're connecting to. In this case, if you have a privileged access workstation connecting to a domain controller, the privileged access workstation has to be as secure as the domain controller. That's why it's very important to follow the best practices around these workstations. So there are different possibilities. First of all, one possibility would be to have two separate physical devices. So your admins would have one notebook to you do the daily tasks on to connect to the internet, and then they would have a second locked down machine which they then use to manage the systems in your network. Another variant would be to have a locked down host, could be also a laptop, where you run shielded VMs, meaning you have one shielded VM to do the daily tasks, connect to the internet, and you have another shielded VM which then is being used for the privileged access. What is very important here is that never make daily tasks on the host, meaning you could also use the host itself as a privileged access workstation and do all the daily tasks in a shielded VM, because for an attacker it's hard, not impossible, but very hard to, if he has compromised a virtual machine, to get to the host from there, but it's very easy to get to a VM if you have compromised the host. Another option would be to use a privileged access management solution. So in this case, the admin would always connect to the PAM with multi-factor authentication. The PAM solution would then connect this user to the system he wants to connect to and fill out credentials automatically, which means the sysadmin connecting would never know these credentials. And once he is done with his work, the PAM solution would also then rotate the password so that any hash lying around somewhere would be invalidated. Um, Multi-factor authentication is also something which should be enforced, and especially on all internet exposed services or interfaces, but also on all internal available management interfaces to manage firewall rules or hypervisor management consoles, backup consoles, etc. Then, of course, for services like password safes and all PAM solutions. What is also possible nowadays is that you could enable MFA for your Windows login. There is different options. One example, something which is quite old already, is smart cards, but it still works. You could also use YubiKeys or certain third-party apps. And just to name one example here, I have seen live in action working is from Duo. And then, of course, the Windows 10 built-in Windows Hello, which uses biometric data. You should really disable or restrict your macros in Office, meaning for Excel, you should have, in best case, macros completely disabled. Also, a way to go is if you need macros to have only digitally signed macros, meaning if you have internally developed macros in your Office documents, make sure to sign them with a valid certificate and only allow digitally signed macros. And in Excel, it's important to mention also that you should disable Excel for macros, because these are quite often used also in ransomware attacks. And for Word, it's the same. You should disable all macros if possible, or otherwise only allow digitally signed macros. You should enforce SMB signing on your network, because many attacks nowadays based on, for example, relaying attacks or all kind of different connection-based attacks, where, as we could see in the beginning, you just listen for ongoing connections, authenticated connections, and you can do that with group policies. So there, important is to mention that you actually have to configure a policy which not only enforces digitally signed communication for the client, but also for the server. And the same for LDAP signing. There you have to configure the policy at two different places, because in this case the LDAP server is the domain controller. So you would have to set this in the default domain controllers policy for the server signing requirements, and for the client signing requirements in the default domain policy. You should really make sure that you reduce your domain admin rights to an absolute minimum, because there is really no reason that for everyday tasks or connections people use domain admin rights. I have seen some third-party software companies who write in their manual, or maybe in a forum, they just recommend to give domain admin rights, which is absolutely crazy. Don't do that. Make sure that you always check what permissions are actually required. So your domain admin group should look like that you have in domain admins, enterprise admins, and the built-in administrators group. You should technically only have this built-in administrator account, which is disabled. In the administrators group, also the standard domain admins and enterprise admins. And in your domain admin group, you should just have all the necessary domain admins which actually require an account to do changes on the domain level. You should also remove local admin rights, meaning your local admin groups on the workstations and servers should look like that, so that you only have the built-in administrator and the default domain admin group. And the built-in administrator should be, in best case, labs managed. I will shortly explain what that is. And the built-in or the default domain admin group, which is added when the machine is joined to a domain, is there for emergency scenarios, and you should make sure through GPOs that domain admins cannot log into the machines. I will come to that later. And one comment here about the domain admin group. So this default should actually not be changed. It's recommended by Microsoft to leave it there. Just make sure that there are not too many members in the domain admin group. And as I said, logon is disabled by GPO. And you should deny the logon to other tiers. So when you come back to the scenario with these different tiers, you really want to make sure that domain admins, for example, cannot log into tier 1 or tier 2 systems. So for a minimum setup, you would create an organizational unit for each tier, and then you would create a GPO for each tier, which prevents different logon types mentioned here from other tiers. So in the end, making sure that no domain admin can somehow log into any of the other tier systems to somehow expose his credentials to an attacker. If you're not yet ready for tiering, what I would really recommend is at minimum make sure that you have a GPO denying the different logon types of domain admins to non-domain controller systems. Then an important point, the principle of least privileges. What does this mean? So you should, whenever you assign permissions to users and service accounts, make sure you only assign the absolute minimum of permissions required. And this also requires you to separate accounts. So you have to separate your accounts regarding tasks, different classification and environments. So you shouldn't have an account which is being used, for example, to support end users and at the same time to connect to database consoles as in database admin. You should make local admin credentials unique, meaning all the local admins on your different machines should not be the same. There should be no password use. So there is one Microsoft solution called Local Admin Password Solution, which can be used for this. And what this does is it manages the local admin password of all machines for you once you have enabled it. It regularly changes them. It sets a long and complex password. It stores this password as an LDAP attribute in Active Directory, and you as the manager of the solution or maybe the domain admin have to make sure that who can access these passwords. And this tool also comes with a small user interface to then read those passwords of the specific machines, and also with PowerShell commandlets to do stuff all in an automated way. It's very easy to deploy. So within a few minutes, you have a complete GPO managing the local admin password of all your clients or servers, and it's free of use. And yeah, as I mentioned, because you are the one who decides who has access to it, make sure to not just deploy this solution and give everyone read labs password rights, because that's technically the same as giving everyone local admin rights. You should store your credentials securely, meaning use, in best case, a password safe or any other solution like that. And you might consider using Credential Guard, which protects your NTLM hashes and Kerberos tickets on all the clients and servers. And you should not store your passwords in group policy objects, scripts, or files in shares, especially the sysvol share. We even saw that scripts being saved on a sysvol share, because the problem there is every domain user has access to sysvol because this is how it has to be. You shouldn't store passwords in any object descriptions in Active Directory or use the user password field in Active Directory, because these are also attributes which can be easily read from everyone. You should implement strict network segregation rules, meaning you should assign your system to different zones based on the classification. So you need to create zones for your clients, for your servers, even split the server zone into maybe database systems, application systems, web servers, etc. And you should also make sure that you have separate zones for management interfaces and environments. Then you have to restrict the traffic between each zone by implementing firewall rules which only allow the specific port or protocol from IP to IP. And you should really use whitelisting approach, that you only allow connections which are required and not blacklist connections which aren't allowed. Some side notes here. If you can, it's a really nice idea to use microsegmentation. For example, with VMware NSX, you can do that. This is actually even better than the classic firewalling concept, because every virtual interface, network interface of a VM, every workload gets his own instance of a firewall. And you could technically create one big flat network where all the machines are in, and with microsegmentation have a very strict firewalling concept in place and centrally manage it. And also, many people underestimate the power of the Windows firewall. So you can actually harden your firewalls with GPOs, meaning you could have kind of a microsegmentation light concept like that. And when it comes to restricting traffic, you should make sure that you also have a proxy server which restricts outbound traffic. So all the connections going outside of your environment should be blocked and controlled as well. For example, phishing attacks, they usually work like that, that the end user within your network triggers the connection to the outside. So you want to make sure this is controlled. And you should force all outgoing connections through this proxy server. Disable internet access by default. Usually servers do not need internet connection, and if they need, you can whitelist the specified connections for those servers to the targets they need. And you should also have a filtering proxy in place which filters any malicious content in any encrypted connections. For these outgoing connections, you should also make sure to have a proper mail gateway in place, and a mail gateway which has malware detection, meaning it should check all incoming mails for certain malware, malicious content in attachment, and it should protect yourself or your users from spoofing attacks, meaning it should use sender policy framework, domain keys identified mail, and domain-based message authentication, reporting, and conformance. And in very shortly explained what these three technical terms do. So sender policy framework makes sure it defines which servers are allowed to send mails in behalf of your domain. DKIM is designed to make sure that messages aren't altered in transit by using cryptographic signature of emails. And the last one is used to protect your domain from unauthorized use in spoofed emails. And an example how this could look like when you have these protections in place. So when you get a spoofed, or when an employee of in your network gets a spoofed email, in this example, someone tried to spoof the internal address. This is displayed with those messages you can see here. And Azure, for example, also allows, or Office 365 allows you to add these external tags, meaning every sender which comes from the outside is automatically tagged as external. It shows that the sender which is displayed to the end user is actually not correct, and also that the sender couldn't be identified. And this also helps a lot in awareness of your end user. So if they see those messages, they can easier identify a phishing mail. Then you should secure your Wi-Fi networks. So you should separate guest and enterprise networks. You should use secure mechanisms like VPA to enterprise in best case. If you need to use VPA to PSK, make sure you have a long complex key. And also you should enforce client isolation, that different devices which are connected to the Wi-Fi cannot attack each other or talk to each other in an unwanted way. Then you should also consider implementing network access control. What this does is it technically disallows someone with a device which is not controlled by you to come into your office and connect it to the network. And there, ideally, certificate-based NAC should be used in combination with MACsec. And what this means, quickly explained, is certificate-based NAC makes sure that all your alleged devices get a certificate which they use to authenticate to your network. And MACsec makes sure that the connections, the communication between the devices and the switches is encrypted, so that if an attacker is in your network and captures network traffic, he cannot see valid MAC addresses, allowed MAC addresses, which he can then spoof. And in exceptions, devices which do not support MACsec, they should use, if possible, certificate-based NAC. And if this is also not possible, then you should consider using MAC whitelisting and restrict certain MAC addresses on certain ports. So with this, we come to our online guide we created, where we list all these measures, and you can find the documentation. I will quickly show you a few examples. So we have the introduction of the admin tier model, which I showed you before, and the enterprise access model. and then we have the different categories and the different measures. And if you click on a measure, you can find the details here. And the idea was to really keep it short and simple. So whenever needed, whenever it was not possible to document this with only a few sentences, we added a link to the complete documentation. I also mentioned the cheat sheet we have. So we added two different cheat sheets actually. One is the security best practices cheat sheet, which in few points lists some important measures and some tools. And the other one is about identifying lateral movement, which is containing a list of basic group policy, audit policy settings you should activate. About some tools. There are first of all those, I call them click and run, means they are very easy to use. You can just download and run them. And one of those is Pincastle, which allows you to create a report about your Active Directory security level. This is very helpful to easily identify some weaknesses and helps you also with some best practices and how to implement them. Then we have the TIS benchmarks from the Center of Information Security or Internet Security. They have a ton of different benchmarks, be it for operating systems or Office or different services. And they also have one for different Windows operating system versions where you can just run the report and it provides you with, or run the tool and it provides you with a report about findings. Then there is some tools which require a little bit more technical knowledge or reading through manuals. For example, Bloodhound, which helps you identify possible attack passes in Active Directory. The second one being Nmap, which helps you to scan for systems and open ports in your network. And the last one being Snaffler, which is very helpful to identify sensitive data lying around on shares or local drives. More tools can be found in our GitHub repository. A short link is here, and you can also find this under Compass Security, here under Security Resources, where we constantly update the list of helpful B documentation or tools. So that concludes our documentation, my presentation. Now, if there is any questions, let's answer some questions. So there was a question about second factor, what kind of second factor we recommend. Yeah, so we still see a lot of SMS-based second factor being used. This should technically not be used anymore. I mean, it's still better than none at all. But regarding phishing safe second factor authentication, we actually had in our last beer talk from Yves Beery this topic. So very shortly explained, what he really recommends is using the YubiKeys. But you will actually find our beer talk also on our YouTube account, so you can go through the whole beer talk where he actually explains all the different weaknesses. Regarding the management of software like SCCM in a tiering model, this is actually a bit a tricky one. So Microsoft technically recommends to separate all management systems, even backup and antivirus for your tiers, even or most importantly, the domain controller, meaning you shouldn't use your central software management tool or even central backup solution to manage or backup your domain controllers, because if this central solution is compromised, then your domain controllers are compromised. Of course, this is a bit tricky, especially more costly if you have a big environment, or no matter if you have a big or not. So um, I know SCCM allows to use distribution points for putting them in different network zones. However, you still have one central console which connects everything together. And in that case, you should make sure that the SCCM central part should be treated as secure as the highest secure system, like the domain controllers, meaning access to the SCCM central console should be absolutely restricted. About handling high privilege tasks without the local admin user. So there is different approaches. I mentioned it's important to remove local admin rights. This doesn't mean that no one is allowed to use them anymore, but there should be a process, a concept that whenever someone needs to do something where he needs privileged access, that he gets them temporarily, either by using a PAM solution or some other way where you temporarily add someone to a local group of some systems until he's done with the work, and then remove the rights again, because they're technically the same for services. It shouldn't be necessary to have local admin rights, of course, during the installation, but then there you should just use software management, central software management solutions which then install the tools, and once the tools are installed, they don't require those rights. Um, let's see if there's any other questions. Deploying of zero trust via GPO, well, I don't think that's that easily doable just with GPOs. I myself am not the best expert when it comes to zero trust, so I'm sure there's better experts out there. That would make actually a good beer talk topic for the future. So maybe we could do something, present something about that. And yeah, I don't see any other questions. So in that case, I thank you very much for that you joined today, were with us, and hope to see you soon. Bye.